Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome all viewers. Inshallah, today we're going to be responding to a comment that was left under a recent video entitled, "You want to debate Islam, bro?" The brother says, Assalamu alaikum, brother Sajid. I've been following a particular da'i, who I'm going to not name, and company for a while, and one could say I'm from their camp too. But I do see your point. It would be great if you could make a video elaborating more concretely on what you think would be the best way to approach da'wah and what you would do differently, say, in the speaker's corner. Especially, what would be the best way to approach those staunch atheists who only listen to rational arguments. JazakumAllahukhairan. So firstly, wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to thank this brother for the genuine question. I appreciate the kind manners, and I appreciate the fact that he's interested in learning and really understanding where I'm coming from. So that being the case, it would be a privilege for me to respond, and I ask that Allah make this video beneficial. So firstly, I want to focus on approaching da'wah. How should we approach the field of da'wah? For starters, I would say that we should hold da'wah in the high esteem that it deserves. When it comes to the medical field, for example, I think this is something that everyone in society generally holds to a very high esteem. Not only do we understand the importance and the benefits of having excellent medical professionals, but we also understand that this is a very deep topic. We know to be a good medical professional, it takes years and years of study and practice. Now, that's not to say nobody except medical professionals can talk about health or medicine. There are certain things that are general that everyone can advise, like eating healthy, exercising. There are certain general things that everyone can call to and remind each other of when it comes to having good health. But at the same time, as a topic of study, if you really want to delve deep into it, you really want to be an excellent professional, we understand that there's a lot to it, and it's very sophisticated, and it takes years and years of dedicated study. Now let's compare that general perspective that people seem to have to our perspective of da'wah. I personally would say from my own experience that da'wah, generally speaking, is nowhere near as respected. And I don't think that's necessarily malicious. I think that's just the way things are. So hopefully, inshallah, in this video, I can start by giving people a glimpse into this field. Now, the main reason I started this channel, if you go back to my very first video, is because Allah blessed me to study at the Islamic University of Medina. And I felt that it was a responsibility to act upon and share what I was learning. Now, for the first 3 years, I studied in the Arabic Institute, learning the language. And after graduating from the Arabic Institute, I entered into the faculty of Dawah wa Usul ad-Din. I spent the following 5 years studying in the faculty of Da'wah and Theology. Now, in order to earn a bachelor's degree in America, a student must complete about 120 credit hours. However, at the Islamic University of Medina in the College of Da'wah, in order to graduate with a bachelor's degree, we needed to earn 167 credit hours. Now, in this video, I just want to share some of the classes that we focused on that relate to Da'wah. For example, one very important class was Usul ad-Da'wah, the foundations of da'wah, where we learn what is da'wah, what are the pillars of da'wah. Somebody who's giving da'wah, what are the characteristics that they should have? What should we take into consideration when it comes to the people we are calling to Islam? How should we call them to Islam? Another class was Tarikh ad-Da'wah, the history of da'wah, where we studied things like how did the prophets give da'wah throughout history. We studied Wasa'il ad-Da'wah, the means of giving da'wah. We had a Tadrib ad-Da'wi, or da'wah training. We even had classes like Turuq at-Tadris, methods of teaching, and Ilm al-Nafs, which is translated as psychology. But even classes like psychology and teaching, education, they were all based on the Quran and Sunnah. And that was one of the things that had the most impact on me studying and living in the city of Medina. Living and seeing how everything was foundationally returning to the Quran and Sunnah. Because growing up in the West, we are brought up to make a clear detachment when it comes to so-called secular things in relation to religious things. But when it comes to Islam, it is a complete religion. It relates to every aspect of human life, and actually living that and seeing that was extremely profound. Anyways, I don't want this video to be too long, but I did want to give a glimpse at one of the books that we studied. And inshallah, this will give you an understanding regarding how one can approach studying da'wah. This book was actually authored by one of the teachers in Kulliyat Dawah. So the first thing you start with is, well, what is da'wah? What's the importance of da'wah? What's the hukm? What's the ruling in Islam regarding da'wah? How much is the world in need of da'wah? And then after that, the first thing we get into is, what are the characteristics of somebody who's giving da'wah? What characteristics should a person calling to Allah have? Now, I'd like to ask you, what do you think is the very first thing he mentions. The first thing he mentions is ilm, knowledge. And of course, anybody who goes down this path of seeking knowledge, from the very first things that are going to be emphasized is the importance of having knowledge. In our religion, a very basic foundational principle is that knowledge precedes, comes before action. Before we do something, we need to have knowledge of what it is that we're doing. This is even a condition of our shahada. When we enter Islam and we testify that nothing is worthy of worship except Allah, we have to have knowledge of what that even means, of what that entails. So of course, da'wah is no exception. If somebody wants to give da'wah, they need to have knowledge. Now that doesn't mean you have to be a bona fide scholar. All of us, inshallah, to a degree, are capable of calling people to Islam. However, it's very important that we all know our limitations. So the first thing mentioned is ilm, knowledge. What do you think the second thing mentioned is? The second thing mentioned is ikhlas, sincerity. All of us should ask ourselves, why are we giving da'wah? Why do we want to give da'wah? What really is the driving force motivating us? And this topic reminds me of a hadith that we studied in the Arabic Institute. In level 3 of the Arabic Institute, we studied this book. This was a class about reading. As you can see, it's gone through quite a bit. The very first chapter of this book, Aqibatul Riya, this is about the consequence, the results of hypocrisy, of showing off, of the dangers of having a bad intention, the dangers of not having ikhlas. And this is the hadith an Abi Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, where he mentions the first 3 people who will be held to account on the Day of Judgment. All 3 of them will be thrown into the hellfire. Now one might think the first 3 people to be held to account and thrown into the hellfire on the Day of Judgment might be a murderer, might be somebody who was very oppressive, somebody who was a criminal. However, what do we find in this hadith? The 3 people mentioned were, number 1, a martyr, number 2, a scholar who learned, taught, and recited the Quran, and number 3, a wealthy person who was extremely generous. Allah will ask each one of these 3 people why they did what they did. What was their intention? What was the real reason? And at first glance, these are 3 of the greatest acts of worship. And each one of these 3 will claim that they did these acts of worship for the sake of Allah. But of course, Allah is all-knowing. There's no fooling Allah. Allah will tell them that they lied. The reason they did these things was to impress the people. The first one wanted to be called a brave warrior. The second wanted to be called a scholar and a reciter of the Quran. And the third one wanted to be called generous. That's why they did it. They didn't have ikhlas. They didn't have sincerity for Allah in these acts of worship. So their reward was given to them in the dunya. They accomplished in the life of this world what they intended to accomplish. He was called a brave warrior. He was called a scholar and a Quran reciter. He was called a generous person. So their reward was with the people, and therefore their reward will not be with Allah. So they will be thrown in the hellfire. And we ask that Allah protect all of us from being thrown in the hellfire. Now, if we go back to this book, and we go back to the table of contents just to see some of the characteristics, some of the ingredients that a caller to Islam should have. We mentioned ilm, knowledge. We mentioned ikhlas, sincerity. The next thing that is mentioned is al-mutaba'ah. The caller to Islam should follow the Quran and Sunnah. So while sincerity is one of the conditions for our actions to be accepted, following the Quran and Sunnah is the second condition. It is crucial that we have both. The next quality that's mentioned is al-hikmah, wisdom. Next is ar-rifq, gentleness. Then as-sabr, patience. Then at-tahalli bil-akhlaq al-fadila, to adorn yourself with the best manners. Then al-qiyam bid-da'wah bil-aham fal-aham. You want to establish your da'wah starting with the most important thing and then going to the next important thing and the next important thing. There is a hierarchy of priorities. Then after focusing on the person calling to Islam, you focus on those being called to Islam. And of course, we're not going to go over everything in this video, but this is just to give people an idea. This is the work of all the prophets. This is from the greatest acts of worship. This is something that the scholars of Islam throughout history have focused heavily on. So firstly, when we approach da'wah, we need to make sure we are holding it in the high esteem it deserves. That we're not just looking at it like it's some hobby, that is something that we just do for fun, that we do it for entertainment, or so that we can be called smart, or skilled, or brave. We need to make sure that we have knowledge of what we're calling to. So this is just one very brief introduction. As for the next two questions, what would you do differently, say, in the speaker's corner? And what would be the best way to approach those staunch atheists who only listen to rational arguments? Inshallah, we will address those in future videos. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end of the video, please let me know in the comments what your favorite drink is. Also, if you like and appreciate these videos and you want to see more, you can become a part of the Dawah team by contributing. Inshallah, the more resources we have, the more videos we can produce, the more books we can publish, the more courses we can develop. Thank you for watching, and inshallah we will finish answering these questions soon. JazakumAllahukhairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.